recording this video on chesswithkinetic.com. Today we're going to be talking about an important defensive idea in rook endgames. And this idea is called frontside defense. So let's have a look at this position. White's pawn is queening towards the bottom of the board. And we'll notice first of all that White's rook is cutting Black's king out of the defense. This means that our king will never be able to cross the d file to get in front of the pawn. This will prevent us from getting some of our easier defensive ideas, such as Fildor's defense, where we would aim to bring our king in front of the pawn and bring our rook to the 6th rank, which we already have a video about on the YouTube channel. So because we can't bring our king up to the pawn, we now have to find a very specific and new idea. But first, let's look at how White will win this position if Black doesn't defend accurately. So let's make a sort of random move here with Black, just to demonstrate. So let's say Black plays rook b8. Not really changing the nature of the position at all, just moving the rook over one square. So now White would push e5. And now let's say Black brought their rook over. Check. White would go king e4. If Black does nothing, then White will go simply push the pawn. So Black will put the rook in front of the pawn to try to stop it from moving. So now if it pushes, we can capture it. So now White will engage in a sort of zigzag maneuver, where it goes king up. Again, if we do nothing, White will simply push the pawn. So check, king g6. So White will again try to stop the pawn from moving with rook e8. White will go king f6. And now we see this zigzag idea, where White is slowly maneuvering their king towards the rook in such a way that they'll never lose the e-pawn. So, okay, let's check again. Now, after king e7, the king has successfully gotten in front of the e-pawn, and White will eventually reach the Lucena position, which is a well-known winning rook endgame, which again we've discussed in a previous video. And this will be the Lucena position. So, okay, let's go back. So instead of rook b8, we need to find a more active defensive plan for Black. And our defensive plan should revolve around the fact that White's pawn is one square further back than it was in this example. So instead of being on the e5 square, White's pawn starts on e4. And this changes a few important things about the position. So in the previous position, White's king was able to zigzag to eventually attack the rook in a way that they wouldn't lose the pawn. But now that White's pawn is one square further back, that means White's king has one square further to maneuver. And this is quite important. So because of this, the move is rook f8 check. If we go anywhere else, White's pawn will push to e5, and it'll be too close. So okay, let's say White engages in the same maneuver. So we go king g5. Again, we go rook e8, attacking the pawn to prevent it from pushing. And again, if White's rook ever leaves the d file, let's say they go rook e1 to defend the pawn, now we can include our king in the defense. And this would be a reasonably simple win, or draw even. So okay, let's say White defends the pawn with their king. Now again, the thing we need to do most importantly is to stop this pawn from ever moving. And the only way we can stop the pawn from moving is by checking the king. So okay, let's say White engages in the same maneuver. So let's say White goes king e6. We go rook e8 check. Now the key difference between the pawn being on e4 and e5 is now White can't go king f6 because the pawn will be hanging. So because of this, White has to move in a way that defends the pawn, king f5, rook f8, and we can just keep checking. And when White's king goes back behind the pawn, because White will eventually realize that moving the king forward isn't fruitful. So White's king will eventually hide behind the pawn again. And now again, it's very important that we stop the pawn from pushing. So we go rook e8 to keep an eye on it. Now there's one last trick that White could have in these positions. And that's, let's say White's king stays on e3. And White shuffles for a couple of moves. So if Black's king moves too far away from the pawn, let's say Black's king goes all the way back. Now all of a sudden, White would have a new resource in this position. So let's just put the king on c8 for argument's sake. Now all of a sudden White could go rook d4. And now because the rook is defending the pawn, White's king now no longer has to. So now let's say we go king c7, king f4. And again, if we ever allow the pawn to push, it would be quite easy for white. So we have to check, king g5, rook e8. And now we see the key difference. The white's king doesn't have to bother defending the pawn anymore. So white can just go king f6. And then after check, go king e7. And push the pawn. So because of this, we have to keep our king on the c6 and c5 squares. And the reason it's those two squares specifically is because from the c6, let's say from c5, the king defends d4 square, so the rook can't move there. And from c6, if the rook ever goes to d4, we can go king c5. And if white's king moves, we would capture the rook. And if white's rook moves to keep defending the pawn, we could again get in front of the pawn with our king. And one last detail to keep in mind is that it's very important that our rook stays as far away from the pawn as possible. And this is because of a concept called checking distance. And the idea is we want to keep the rook really far away from the pawn so white's king can never sneak up on us. So for example, if our rook was on e7, and we'll put the rook back on d1. Now this would actually be winning again for white, because after king f4, check, king e5, check, king here. Now white's king can go to e6. And because our rook isn't one square further back, because our rook isn't on f8, we no longer have the option of going rook to e8 check, which we had in the previous positions. So this would be winning. So a good rule of thumb for figuring out if you have enough checking distance is that there should be at least 3 empty squares between your rook and the pawn in order for it to be winning. So if white ever gets to push the pawn, there would only be 2 empty squares and we wouldn't have great enough checking distance. And conversely, if we ever push our rook, there would be again less squares in between the rook and the pawn, so there wouldn't be enough checking distance. So okay, this was frontside defense. Thank you for watching and goodbye.